want you to know today, I'm so glad that my life is not my own. I'm glad that it's not in the hands of the world. I'm glad that the snapshots of my low moments are not the end of the story. But I have a God that is the author. I have a God that is the finisher of my faith.
Today on Finding a Better Way of Life, our message is the end justifies the means. In a worldly sense, we understand that that is false. We have to be careful how we act just to get to a certain point. But with God, He's perfect. So He always starts at the end and works backward to get us there. So thank you for joining us today and enjoy today's message.
Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful, or full of pity, and of tender mercy. And so today I want to minister to you on this word that I have entitled, The End Justifies the Means. The end justifies the means. Now, this phrase is not one that's unfamiliar to us, because it is often said as a cliche, the end does not justify the means. And I believe that is true in a human sense. In a finite sense, when it comes to mankind, the end doesn't necessarily justify the means. And so what does that mean to us? That means that we can't just do whatever we want to do and hurt whoever we want to hurt, as long as we get to the ultimate end that we're trying to reach, right? And so we are finite, and we are limited by a linear timeline. What does that mean? That means that we are always moving forward in time. We are creatures of time and space, and we are limited by those things. But God is not like that. He is not limited in time or in space. And so when you and I do something, when we make plans, many times there are unintended consequences. They're unintended. We didn't mean for things to happen the way they happened. We didn't mean for things to unfold the way they unfolded, but we were just hoping for the best, and ultimately maybe something didn't turn out exactly like we wanted. I'm sure all of us have started a project, and we measured twice and we cut once, and ultimately we had to measure a couple of more times and maybe get some more boards and cut again. In fact, my dad always had a funny statement. He said, I've cut it 3 times and it's still too short. And so there's a process of unintended consequences. Sometimes you and I, in our finite thinking, we do not see the ultimate results of what is going to take place in our mind and in our heart and in our life as we begin to move forward. So we are creatures of time, and so many times we are affected by the unintended consequences of our actions or of our decisions or of our plans. In fact, in history, there is this thing called the Cobra effect. It sounds pretty ominous, right? The Cobra effect. It is an example of the law of unintended consequences. And so back years ago, the government of India was so concerned about these terribly venomous cobras. There were so many of them that they put out a bounty for them. And they thought that because they put out a bounty for them, that ultimately the population of cobras would go down. And initially that happened. It took place that way. The population began to go down. These industrious people began to go out and catch them. I'm glad that wasn't me. I wouldn't be catching snakes. But somebody wanted to catch snakes, and they would turn them in for the bounty. But ultimately, people found that finding them was harder than raising them. And so the unintended consequences of this cobra population control system, this bounty where they were trading money for dead cobras, made it where the people started raising them. And so the population did not change. It didn't go down, it started to go up. And then the government recognized that this was happening, so they just cut off the bounty. And there was no more money for the cobras being turned in. And so guess what the raisers of these cobras did? They got them out of their cages. They didn't want to feed them anymore. And they put them out on the streets. And so the law of unintended consequences for this situation was that the population of cobras did not go down, but it went way up because now there was a whole new source of them out. And so many times when we begin to plan and we begin to make decisions for our own lives, so many times we find that there are unintended consequences. But I'm so glad to tell you today that God is not limited by time or space. He is not limited by the dangers of unintended consequences, because today He is infinite in scope. He is eternal in existence. He is sovereign in power. He holds all wisdom and He holds all knowledge. He is self-existing and self-sustaining. Time exists in Him. Space exists in Him. He is eternal. He is from the beginning to the end, and from the end to the beginning. He is everything in between. And so today, God is not bound by time or location. He is not limited by a linear timeline, because He is eternal. And so when He begins to unfold things in our lives, and when He begins to allow things to happen in our lives, there is no oops in God. He doesn't stand back and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or, well, I didn't see that coming, right? That's us. That's human nature. But God never says, I didn't see that coming, or oops, I didn't know that was going to happen. He always knows the end from the beginning. He has never made one mistake. He has never failed. He has never fumbled. He has never had a second thought. He is always right. He is always perfect. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is no shadow of turning in Him. He is constant today. And so I want you to know that you can rest in this, that with God, the end always justifies the means. Now, I will say that there are things that happen in our lives, that God allows in our life, that God puts in our life, that to us at the moment, in that time and space that we are living in right there, we don't know what's going on. We don't understand what God is doing, right? And so we look at our circumstance and we are uncertain. And sometimes we are fearful because we don't know what's happening. But I want you to know today that you don't have to worry about God. He knows exactly what's going on. And so you can put yourself into his hands today without worrying about what the consequences of that's going to be. Because in God, everything works for the good of those that love God and those that are called according to his purpose. The only desire that we need to have is to make sure that we stay in love with him and that we stay right in the center of his purpose. Whether that takes us into a valley or whether that takes us to a mountain, whether that takes us into the light or whether that takes us into the darkness, whatever that is, I want you to know today that I want the will of God in my life because his purpose is greater than any circumstance that I find myself in. Because I know that ultimately everything that he does is for my good. Everything that he's working out in my life is for my good. Every enemy that attacks me physically or spiritually in our lives, I know that ultimately it's going to be for my good. Amen. And so one of my favorite characters in all of Scripture, and I use it quite often, is the life of Joseph. And that's because you can see the highs and the lows of every life. You can see the struggle of circumstance and uncertainty as it affects this young man. Of course, we know that he was born to Jacob and Rachel had not been able to have a child for many years. And so once he was born, he was favored by his father. In fact, he was favored so much that his brothers were jealous. Jacob made Joseph a coat of many colors, and then God gave Joseph a dream, and in that dream he saw the sheaves bow down to his sheaf, and this represented that his brothers would ultimately bow down to him. And then he saw the sun and the moon, and this meant that ultimately his parents would bow down to him. And being young and impetuous, he told this to his brothers. And in our minds, maybe we look at the consequences of him telling his brothers that, and it stoked their anger, and it made them hate him even the more. And so we look back, and in our mind we think, well, Joseph, maybe you should have kept your mouth shut. Maybe you should have whispered that to somebody that really loved you, but you shouldn't have told your brothers that. But you know what? God has a way of using all the circumstances around us to propel us toward our purpose. And so that day that he went out to check on his brothers, they saw him coming and they began to conspire against him. And he ultimately was found they put him down in the pit to hold him, and they said they were going to kill him. And then one of them spoke up and said, no, I don't think we should kill him. I think we should sell him. And so this was not something that happened by accident. This was something that God had orchestrated. Because what Joseph could not tell while he was in his time and in his space and in his moment, what he could not recognize is that God was setting things in motion to ultimately fulfill the dream that could not be fulfilled in his father's house. It was not going to be fulfilled in the safety of his home. It was not going to be fulfilled in the love of his brothers. But it took hate and jealousy. It took a pit and it took slavery, and it took Potiphar's house to propel him toward what God ultimately had for him. And so I want you to know that no matter what God is doing in your life, if you will stay in the center of God's purpose, if you will stay fully sold out, absolutely, completely in love with the things of God, with the purpose of God, I promise you that no matter what happens, no matter what God allows to come to you, no matter what hate is thrown your way, no matter what battle comes your way, no matter what weapon is formed against you, I promise that God is going to use those things, and he's going to take you to an ultimate end that is for his glory and for his purpose. And so the pit and Potiphar's house and the lie and the lust of Potiphar's wife that ultimately pushed him into the prison down where he thought he would never be found again. But what he had no way of knowing that day is that when he entered into prison, that ultimately as he walked through that cell door, he was walking through a place. He was crossing a threshold that was going to take him ultimately to a palace. It did not look like the way to a palace. It did not look like the path to a throne room. But oh, that day when God ultimately took him from the pit to Potiphar's house to the prison, what he had no way of knowing is that God was working on the dream that he gave him so many years before. He was opening the door to the purpose that God had placed in his life that he had no way of understanding. And so ultimately he ended up in the palace, as we know, second in command, second only to Pharaoh himself. He found himself there, and then his family began to go through a famine, a drought. They were hungry. They had nowhere to turn, but someone, maybe a traveler, came by and said, "Hey, I hear that there's grain in Egypt." And so here we see one of these purposes. I look at the life of Joseph, and God had put into motion a plan. And it was for Joseph himself, but it was also for Jacob and his brothers. But it was not just for Jacob and his brothers, but there was a larger purpose. There was a bigger purpose that God was working on. And I think sometimes when we're in the middle of what we are going through, when we're in the middle of our issue, that sometimes we become so myopic that all we can see is the trouble that's right in front of us. All we can see is the sickness that is going on in our own lives. All we can see is the battle that you and I are facing at the moment. But oh, I want you to know that we serve a God today that knows right where you are. He knows your name. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows the number of your days. And He has a plan for you. But not only does He have a plan for you, but He has a plan for your family. And not only does He have a plan for your family, but He has a plan for His church. And not only does He have a plan for His church, but He has a plan for the world. I'm telling you today that if you are in the middle of His purpose, if you are fully sold out in love with Him, I promise you that He is using your life to show forth the glory and the power and His ability to move in the life of people, of families, and of nations. And so in Joseph's life, not only was he setting Joseph up for success, but he was setting Joseph up in a place where he could fulfill the purpose of God in his family's life. And he could feed them, but not only would he feed them, but he would bring them to Egypt. And he would put them in one of the most fertile places on earth. And this band of approximately 70 people, this small nomadic family, seems a little big to us, but when you see what it was ultimately to become, then it just 70 souls came into Egypt. But God put them right where He wanted them. And in the years of Joseph, they were blessed. They were given favor. They were given the most fertile property. They were given tax breaks and blessings. And they began to grow. In fact, they grew so large that the Bible says there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. He didn't know what Joseph had done for Egypt. He didn't realize the place where he stood in the history of the kingdom. And so he looked at these people. They were strangers to him. And he said, oh, we've got to be careful because these people are so blessed. They're not just blessed financially, but they're multiplying. They're becoming a great nation. And if we're not careful, they're going to team up with some of our enemies. And they're going to take over. They're going to defeat us. That's the kind of place God put them in. And then, quickly, let me show you this. That Pharaoh that knew not Joseph and was afraid of the numbers of Israel as they grew, as they became a nation, he began to pressure them. He tried to kill their young. This propelled Moses, his mother, to put him in a basket and set him loose on the river, right? Took him to Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh took Moses into his own family. His daughter found him, took him into his own family. And I always like to say that God sent Moses to college and made the devil pay for it. He lived in one of the most civilized and proper nations of the world. They had the greatest knowledge of science and understanding. Though primitive it may have been, it was the most at that time. And all of the methods of war and battle and organization and all this stuff. He was right there in the middle of it. He went to the greatest college on earth. And the devil paid for it. Now, from Joseph to Moses, to the Red Sea, to the wilderness, to Mount Sinai, and ultimately to the Promised Land. I'm telling you, not one of these things happened on accident. God always has a plan. Because we are finite beings, because we have limited understanding, we have limited scope. Our vision of the future is definitely not 2020. That's why we use the cliche that hindsight is 2020. When we look back, we say, well, hey, I should have known that was going to happen. And look at that. And look what went on here and there. And so when we look to the future, we're finite. We don't really know what's going on. And so when we're in the middle of our struggle, in our battle, sometimes we look at our circumstance and we become fearful. And we become paralyzed in our faith because we're not sure what's going to happen next. And if you took a snapshot of the moment, it may look like the story of our life was coming to an end. And in our own lives, sometimes if you took a snapshot of a moment, you might think that my life was over, my ministry had come to an end, my effectiveness had stopped. But in the next moment, God is pulling us out. He is opening a door. He is moving in our lives. And so snapshots will lie. In the story we talked about today, if you took a picture of Joseph in the pit with his brothers murmuring and complaining and their words of hatred spilling over the top of that pit down into the dark depths where he could hear their murderous plans, if you took a snapshot, you might think, poor Joseph. If you took a snapshot of Joseph being pulled up and put on a cart, tied and bound for Egypt in slavery. If you saw him, if you took a snapshot of him in Potiphar's house, you might think, well, he's made it. He's on the top of everything now. Everything that Potiphar owns is in the hand of Joseph. He's now made it to the top. This is where he's going to stay. Snapshot, but that wouldn't be the whole story. Then you see Potiphar's wife grabbing for his cloak and lusting after him and then ultimately lying about him. If you took a snapshot of him being placed into prison, you might think, all that potential is wasted. Everything that God promised is gone. But if you took a snapshot of that moment, that would be a lie. If you took a snapshot of the dark, dirty prison, no hope, No light at the end of the tunnel. You may think it's all over, but oh, wait a minute. Today in the life of Joseph, all the negative was beginning to develop into a different picture, because it ended in a palace. It ended with power. It ended with blessing. It ended with place and position that only God could give. And so you take that snapshot of the down times. It's a lie. And I want you to know today, I'm so glad that my life is not my own. I'm glad that it's not in the hands of the world. I'm glad that the snapshots of my low moments are not the end of the story. But oh, I have a God that is the author. I have a God that is the finisher. And so today, if you feel like there is an end to your story, if you feel like it's going to be a tragedy, oh, just hold on, because ultimately God is going to throw back the curtain. God is going to reveal everything in His time, because the end is in the hands of God. The end is not in the hand of the devil. In fact, the reason he fights so hard is because he knows the end. And just like Joseph told his brothers, he said, don't worry, don't be fearful, because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. What a perspective. My story is still ongoing. The period has not been placed at the end yet, because as long as God is still involved. And so in the ups and the downs, in the struggles, in the misunderstandings, in the battles, in the mountaintop experiences, and in the low valley, in the dark places, in the light places, and in the uphill battle and the downhill slide, all of those things. And so with God, the end surely justifies the means. In fact, I've heard it said, I think it was Brother Jeff Arnold that said it. He said, God starts at the end and He works His way back in someone's life to get you to that point. Whatever happens around the next bend, whatever reveals itself tomorrow morning or the next day or next week, I promise you that God is never surprised. God is never shocked. He never has to deal with unintended consequences, because He knows the end from the beginning. The prophet Isaiah said it this way in chapter 48 and verse 3, I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth, and I showed them, and I did them suddenly, and they came to pass. I tell you, His ways are perfect. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end.
With God, the end justifies the means. He's going to do whatever it takes to fulfill the promises that He's given you, because He knows the end from the beginning. And if you stick with Him, if you trust Him, I promise you will find a better way of life. Thank you for joining us today. God bless you.